One of the things I think is valuable to do, aside from just looking at current events and theoretical topics and things like that, to kind of test how we think and check our biases, etc., is to look historically and look at events where you have the luxury of kind of being able to look at all the facts removed from the actual event. So that kind of fog of war, if you will, is removed. And you have the luxury of hindsight, in which you can really see how actions played out. At times you can even have individuals who are making decisions actually, give interviews or explanations well after the fact as to what their thinking was. And again, you get to see the implications or the consequence of some of those actions. So I think that could be a useful thing to use in and of itself. So I've spent some time, looking at historical events like our decision to drop the atomic bomb in World War II, or Abraham Lincoln's decision to try and keep the Union intact. Because I think there's a lot to be learned in looking at some of those decisions. But in addition to just looking at them in isolation, I think there's an opportunity to use them to look at the events of today and get just a different perspective, really. That's what it's usually all about. It's just, it's rarely do I ever use any of these exercises or tools to say, use this to change your mind, use this to get to the exact right answer, because that can often be very elusive. But just use it to open your mind a bit and get a better perspective. So an example of that that I think is pretty relevant is related to Abraham Lincoln, as I just mentioned, and one aspect of how he handled the Civil War, and specifically his suspension of habeas corpus. So the idea that it's unconstitutional to imprison somebody indefinitely unless they're charged with a crime and they go through kind of the due process that's been set up. So for those unfamiliar and without getting into too many of the details, at the time of the Civil War, Lincoln feared that Southern supporters and their propaganda and some of their communications might turn the tide of the war, right? If that propaganda got out and it started getting more and more people in the North, as part of the Union, thinking either this war can't be won or it's not a war we should even be fighting, we should just let the South kind of go off and do their own thing, that would risk losing the Union. And Lincoln, at all costs, his goal was to keep the Union intact. There's actually a quote, and I'll paraphrase it a bit, but he said it more or less saying, if I can free the slaves and maintain the Union, I would absolutely do it. If I can maintain the Union but not free any slaves, I would absolutely do it. And the idea being, like, his goal was to keep the Union intact. He's often viewed and remembered for freeing the slaves, which he did, and it's not to say that he didn't care about slaves or anything like that, but it's just to highlight that his main goal, what he believed was his objective, right? We've talked about objectives and kind of making sure that you have that answer to the why am I doing what I'm doing. His was very clear to him. You keep the Union intact. So one of the tactics he took was the suspension of habeas corpus to do that. For most people, Americans, who have some sense of American history or just kind of pride in America or what have you, that's a pretty severe, extreme act to take, because that's kind of a fundamental right that we treasure as Americans. Dictators, monarchies, things like that. You have these instances throughout history where they will jail people that just disagree with them or, for whatever reason they deem fit. And it really destroys, freedom and freedom of speech and lots of things that we take for granted in a democracy as we have today. So when you think about that and the fact that he did it at that time, again, pretty controversial. And it was controversial at the time, right? There was I want to say probably hundreds of journalists and doctors and lawyers and all different types of professionals that were jailed at that time by Lincoln under this kind of order, even at times where the courts would get involved and say, hey, this isn't constitutional, you have to release these people, and he just ignored them because it was in the midst of the war. So you look at that type of act and you compare it to today, right, and what we're going through with the coronavirus, and there's lots of talk about the actions that are being taken by government officials, whether it be governors or the federal government or what have you, to lock down the country, take these extreme measures that are limiting or in some cases erasing civil liberties for the greater good. And you can see a lot of similarities there. And it's an interesting thing to gain perspective on, because there's lots of people who would you know, you ask him, hey, what do you think about Abraham Lincoln? And for many people, he's the greatest president we've ever had, and lots of good reasons to believe that. And they don't think much about this fact, right? There's a lot of people that wouldn't even remember that Lincoln did this, that he took away civil liberties in this way. So, you know, it kind of makes you think, well, what does that mean, right? Today, when it's happening, when we're in the midst of it, and we're not sure how it's going to play out, we're not sure what the right decision was or wasn't. There's lots of people that see civil liberties being threatened or taken away, and it's a non-starter, right? For them, as soon as they see that there is evil going on, the government is wrong, we need to fix it, we need to turn off whatever it is they're doing, and it's very clear and it's very simple to them. You can't do that. It's unacceptable. But then again, you take those same people and you ask them about Abraham Lincoln, and they'll have nothing but good things and praise to say. So to get that perspective, as we talk about, it's really interesting to think of it through that lens and say, okay, well, let's look back at the facts and the history of what happened with Lincoln, and when he suspended these civil liberties. Are you okay with that? And what you'll start to see potentially is some people who might say, no, I'm not okay with that. And I didn't realize that about Lincoln. And even in that case, it opens their mind to say, hey, things aren't as simple and clear as I thought, right? I just thought Lincoln was a great president, but now that I hear this or I know this, changes my view a little bit. So things that I was certain about in that realm, maybe I'm not as certain anymore. For other people, they might say, listen, I don't love that he did that, but given the extreme circumstances of the time, it was the right decision and it paid off, right? The risk was too great, where if he didn't do it and the tide started to turn and we lost the Union, like we couldn't let that happen. So although it wasn't a good act that he did, it was a necessary one, and he knew that. And we trust in him because, having the luxury of hindsight, we know that he did it for the right reasons. But what's interesting about that is, again, it's if you try and put yourself in the shoes of the person at the time, if you have the view that you hold today, that you're not willing to sacrifice any civil liberties, likely you would have been one of those people saying, hey, he's going too far. We got to get this guy out of office. This is absurd. This isn't America. The country's falling apart. So it really makes you question how you come to your opinions and your views. Is it consistent? Are you applying a consistent framework? If you view it in the case of Lincoln versus today differently, you have to ask yourself why. Why there's a great threat. There's a threat to the country. There's a threat to American lives. There's a threat to the way in which we live. So politicians, the government is taking actions to try and minimize that, much like he did. Well, again, so you start going down the path of like, well, what's different here? And maybe it's different, maybe it's not. But that's a great exercise for you to go through and start looking at that and trying to get that perspective on kind of where you sit on it. So I think, again, that ability to look back in hindsight and look at this and challenge yourself to say, how would I have handled it then? Would I have been as consistent? And again, with the luxury of hindsight, how easy it is to say, okay, sometimes it is worth making certain sacrifices, or these decisions that seem bad in the moment, once you see how they play out, are okay. It may open your mind a little bit more to at least, again, see another perspective. And as we've talked about in other videos, entertain the possibility that maybe some of the things that seem absolutely atrocious and horrible and unspeakable or unconscionable today maybe aren't that bad when you put them in that perspective.